Caitlin Clark walked into Gamebridge Fieldhouse on Friday night already furious, not at the Golden State Valkyries, not at the opposing defensive game plan. She was completely, unapologetically furious at the fabricated, insulting narrative. There is a terrifying, defining breaking point for every transcendent athlete when they realize they are fighting an exhausting multi-front war. And the day before tip-off, Clark sat at the press conference podium and completely obliterated the lying media establishment. She looked directly into the cameras and corrected the exact indisputable injury timeline that had been maliciously misreported all week. She stated the absolute facts. And I actually went back and looked because of all these narratives that are going crazy online about when I told my mom I wasn't going to play the game. 447 and you guys found out at 5:20. So, one of the most important people in my life found out 40 minutes before you guys. That is Caitlin Clark telling the entire basketball world that the suggestion of an injury reporting cover-up is mathematically absurd because the timeline was ruthlessly tight. She was angrier than she has been at any press conference this entire season. And the very next night, she channeled that pure cinematic rage into one of the most devastating, entertaining, and weaponized performances the Indiana Fever have ever witnessed. Welcome back. This is WNBA Pro, and today we are completely ripping the doors off the hinges to document the most ruthless, vindicating, and aggressive performance of Caitlin Clark's professional career. We are seamlessly blending the explosive raw anger of a superstar pushed to her absolute psychological limits with the cold, hard, indisputable analytical credibility of a 90-82 victory. What Caitlin Clark did against the Golden State Valkyries was not just a masterpiece. It was an absolute statement of psychological warfare. To the media, to the league, to every single narrative that tried to diminish her. We are going to break down the physical assault she survived, the double technical that awakened a monster, and the brutally honest admission from the opposing head coach that proved Clark is entirely unstoppable. Let me walk you through the actual geometry and violence of this basketball game as it actually happened. Because the box score simply gives you the numbers, the actual game film reveals a completely unhinged street brawl. They kind of did everything they could to stop Caitlin. And you got to give Nas credit because she is the guard stopper. That's her thing. That's her thing. She's able to stop guards. And she did everything to try to stop Caitlin. It didn't work. The first half was an absolute physical war. The Valkyries came into Indianapolis with a highly specific defensive blueprint designed by head coach Natalie Nakase. Nas is one of the smartest, most analytical defensive minds in the WNBA. She has been meticulously studying Clark's game tape since her historic run at Iowa. She knew the mechanics of the left step back. She knew the exact range of the logo 3. She knew about Clark's brilliant hesitation move that creates space for the pull-up jumper. And she designed a defensive scheme entirely predicated on sanctioned physical assault to take those specific shots away. The Valkyries threw multiple bodies at her. Constant disruption, relentless physicality at every single catch. The explicit goal was to make Clark deeply uncomfortable and keep her from settling into her natural, highly lethal rhythm. And for the first 2 quarters, Nas's defensive scheme created real legitimate problems. The physicality disrupted the timing. The multiple defenders made it nearly impossible to secure comfortable catches. But if the Golden State Valkyries thought this level of sanctioned bullying was going to make Caitlin Clark shrink, they completely fatally miscalculated her psychological makeup. Before we get to the Gabby was what? Right before the break we got a little John going on. Caitlin says, "Hey, Kelly, look at Caitlin Bleer kisses. Caitlin Bleer kisses bro 514 to go. Look. So no, it was Janelle Sloan and Caitlin Clark. Referees had to step in. Look at Caitlin guys. So, at the absolute climax of the first half, the tension finally snapped. Clark put her head down, drove violently to the basket, and aggressively swatted at a loose ball in the arms of Valky's forward Janelle Sloan. Sloan took immediate exception to the extra contact. She got directly physically into Clark's face. The two of them started jawing relentlessly at each other. The benches started creeping toward the hardwood. Veronica Burton had to physically step in to separate the combatants and the officials immediately handed out double technical fouls. One for Clark, one for Sloan. Both teams went to the locker room at halftime with the air completely sucked out of the arena, holding the tension of a game that was about to violently explode. Nobody in the mainstream media is talking about what that specific double technical actually meant for the trajectory of the second half. Let me explain the psychology of a generational competitor. Caitlin Clark is not a player who arbitrarily picks petty fights. She does not initiate meaningless physical confrontations. She absorbs the contact and she weaponizes it. That specific altercation with Salon, perfectly combined with the exhausting week she had just endured regarding the back injury narrative and the toxic media scrutiny, created an absolute perfect storm of competitive, unadulterated anger. You do not break a generational genius with cheap shots. You simply awaken an absolute monster. It's damn near all in the game, bro. It's just damn near all the game. Let me pull this up real quick. Let me pull the game cache back up real quick. So, it's another timeout. So, the Fever call a full time. Why would Stephanie White call a timeout? I don't know what happened. I got to see what happened, guys. Caitlin Clark came out of the locker room in the third quarter and completely went to the dark side of the force. She brought the basketball up the court, calmly walked directly to the logo 33 feet away from the basket and pulled up. Tie game at 48. In front of the home crowd that had been showing up with empty seats and doubts. After a double technical and after an incredibly infuriating week of media lies, she pulled up from a different zip code and swished it flawlessly. And then she did not just jog quietly back on defense. She turned directly to Valkyries veteran guard Tiffany Hayes, stepped into her personal space, and talked absolute unfiltered trash. Not aggressively, not maliciously, but the exact terrifying way that apex competitors who respect each other talk trash in the middle of a war that actually matters. Clark said something. Hayes said something back. And the crowd at Gainbridge Fieldhouse went absolutely undeniably electric. It was an on-court exorcism. She was physically expelling all the frustration from the media lies and the Valkyries' defensive hacking, channeling every single ounce of that toxic energy into utterly destroying the scheme standing in front of her. That specific moment, the 33FT logo 3 followed by the cold-blooded trash talk, is exactly who Caitlin Clark actually is. Not the player who gets pulled with 7 minutes to go in a decided game. Not the player whose injury timeline gets twisted by local beat reporters. She is the superstar who takes a week of absolute garbage, hits a logo 3, talks trash to a seasoned all-star and completely takes over the basketball game. Aaliyah Boston Kelsey assist. Caitlin Clark makes 2 free throws. Tip Hayes hits a 3. Sophie Conan makes a free throw. Caitlin hits a big 3 to tie it up from like 30 from 30. Kate, they go hit a 3. Hines Allen's okay. And then suddenly it's like Caitlin makes a real tough layup and one. She makes a super tough and one to give the Fever the lead for the first time. Caitlin misses a circus shot, then hits Sophie, doing it all on that defensive possession. Clark from another stratosphere. Once Clark hit that impossible shot from the logo, Naz's entire defensive scheme was forced to desperately adjust. And the exact second the scheme adjusted, the passing lanes ripped wide open and the transition assists started flowing like water. Clark finished the night with an absolute masterpiece. 22 points, 9 highly efficient assists, and 4 made 3-pointers on 9 attempts. She played 32 grueling minutes. The Valkyries game plan completely broke down in the second half because Clark is simply too offensively brilliant for any scheme to contain for a full game without the defensive players paying a physical price that becomes completely unsustainable. And when Caitlin Clark operates with this level of ruthless ball-dominant efficiency, the entire ecosystem of the Indiana Fever completely thrives. Aaliyah Boston unlocked the absolute best version of herself. Boston delivered what was arguably the quietest, most devastatingly dominant 16-rebound performance in the history of the franchise. She completely owned the painted area, scoring 20 points on an incredibly efficient 8 of 15 shooting. When Clark is orchestrating the transition game and hitting Boston in stride, this team becomes a terrifying championship-caliber threat. But to establish absolute credibility, you do not just have to take our word for it. Listen to what the opposing coach admitted after the final buzzer. 16 rebounds with 24 seconds left in this one. Caitlin Clark don't look like she's going to get a double-double, but you never know. You just never know. But they out fouling, so I doubt she get it. 22-9 and 9 and 2. 229 and 2. Solid numbers, bro. Caitlin Clark been averaging 20 points a game, guys. Natalie Nakase is one of the most brilliant coaches in the WNBA. She has an extensive resume, including time as an assistant with the Golden State Warriors. She studies the film relentlessly, and after the 90-82 loss, she was brutally honest about what she witnessed. Nakase publicly acknowledged that Clark simply made the impossible adjustments. Clark found the microscopic spaces that the defensive scheme left open. She made the precise laser-guided passes that the Valkyries were completely unprepared for. Because as Nas realized, you can prepare for the left step back and you can prepare for the logo 3. But you absolutely cannot prepare for a basketball sont who diagnoses your defensive weakness in real time and surgically exploits it. That is the ultimate hallmark of an elite generational player. She does not just execute her own skill set. She actively finds the fatal flaw in yours and completely breaks it. The Indiana Fever are officially 4-2. Caitlin Clark is completely healthy. Aaliyah Boston just had her best game of the season. The momentum is absolutely undeniable. This is the Caitlin Clark that the entire league is completely terrified of. Not the load-managed version, not the highly protected 23-minute version. The angry, completely focused, trash-talking, logo 3-hitting, team-carrying version. That is the apex predator who is going to lead the Indiana Fever through this incredibly toxic season. And on Friday night, she reminded every single executive, reporter, and defensive specialist exactly who she is. This is WNBA Pro. Smash that subscribe button right now if you want the absolutely fearless high-octane analysis that tells the actual stories behind the box score. Drop your most explosive take in the comments below. Hit the notification bell because this team is just getting started. The momentum is completely shifting and we are documenting every single piece of the wreckage. The fourth quarter is where the entire night transformed from a heated basketball game into a full-scale warning shot to the rest of the WNBA. Because once Caitlin Clark smelled weakness in the Valkyries' defense, she stopped playing cautiously and started hunting. That is the terrifying evolution that separates great players from generational superstars. Great players react to the game in front of them. Generational players completely seize emotional control of the arena itself. Every possession in the final quarter felt like psychological pressure being applied in real time. The Valkyries' defenders were exhausted. The constant bumping, trapping, and overcommitting that worked early in the game had started draining their legs. And against almost any other player in the league, that physical strategy probably works for 40 minutes. But against Clark, the margin for error disappears the second your energy level drops by even 5%. That is what happened Friday night. You could physically see defenders hesitating for half a second longer on screens because they were terrified of getting embarrassed from 30 feet. And the instant hesitation appeared, Clark dissected it. One possession she attacked downhill and forced help defense. The next possession she slowed the pace entirely, baited the switch, and whipped a cross-court laser pass directly into the shooting pocket. Then she would casually jog over half court and pull from the logo like she was practicing alone in an empty gym. That is not normal basketball behavior. That is psychological domination. And what makes it even more devastating is the emotional context surrounding the performance. Caitlin Clark was not operating from a place of comfort. She was operating from accumulated frustration. Every question about the injury. Every narrative suggesting drama behind the scenes. Every implication that the Fever were somehow hiding information. Every cheap foul she absorbed during the first half. It all stacked together into one giant emotional fuel source. The media wanted a controversy. Instead, they accidentally created a monster performance. And you could feel the exact moment the crowd realized it too. Gainbridge Fieldhouse completely changed personalities during that second half run. Early in the game, the energy was nervous. Fans were waiting to see if Clark looked healthy. Waiting to see if the offense looked disconnected. Waiting to see whether the Valkyries' defensive pressure would finally frustrate Indiana into mistakes. But after that logo 3 and the trash talk sequence with Tiffany Hayes, the building turned into chaos. Every touch Clark got suddenly felt dangerous. Every transition push created panic. Every screen forced defenders into impossible decisions. And this is the part people outside Indiana still do not fully understand about Caitlin Clark's impact on professional basketball. Her presence does not simply improve the Fever offense statistically. She completely bends the emotional atmosphere of the game itself. Defenders start rushing rotations. Coaches burn timeouts earlier than planned. Opponents begin forcing low-percentage shots because they are terrified of allowing transition opportunities the other way. Clark creates basketball anxiety. That is why teams spend entire defensive game plans obsessing over her location on the floor. Because the second she gets comfortable, the game spirals. And credit absolutely has to go to Aaliyah Boston for recognizing every single opening Clark generated. Boston played with incredible patience Friday night. She did not force bad post entries. She did not rush shots in traffic. She trusted that Clark would eventually collapse the defense enough to create clean opportunities around the rim. That chemistry is becoming terrifyingly advanced. There were multiple possessions where Clark delivered passes before Boston even fully turned toward the basket. That level of timing only happens when two players completely trust each other's instincts. And once that trust becomes automatic, defenses are in serious trouble. Because now opponents have to make impossible choices. Do you trap Clark 30 feet from the basket and leave Boston with deep post position? Do you stay attached to shooters and allow Clark to attack one-on-one? Do you switch screens and risk Clark hunting mismatches all night? There is no perfect answer. That is why the Fever suddenly look dramatically more dangerous than they did earlier this season. And the scariest part for the rest of the league is that Clark still does not look fully unleashed yet. People keep talking about her scoring numbers while missing the much bigger picture. The true evolution happening right now is her command of tempo. Earlier in the season there were moments where Clark played too fast emotionally. She would try to force difficult passes or launch quick shots because she wanted to immediately flip momentum. Now she is controlling games like a veteran. Against Golden State, she repeatedly manipulated defensive spacing like a quarterback reading coverages. She slowed possessions down when Indiana needed composure. Then seconds later she would explode into transition before defenders could recover mentally. That balance is deadly. And it explains why Natalie Nakase sounded almost resigned after the game. Because coaches know the difference between a player getting hot and a player completely solving your defensive structure. Clark solved it. That is what Friday night really was. The Valkyries did not lose because they lacked effort. They lost because their original game plan stopped functioning once Clark adapted to it. And when a superstar starts processing adjustments faster than your team can respond, the game becomes almost impossible to manage. Especially when that superstar is emotionally angry. That is the hidden element casual viewers never fully appreciate about elite athletes. Anger can become a performance enhancer when it is controlled properly. And Friday night, Clark weaponized it perfectly. She never lost emotional control. She never spiraled into reckless basketball. She never started forcing hero shots out of frustration. Instead, she became sharper, more aggressive, more precise. That is what terrified Golden State in the second half. And honestly, that is what should terrify the rest of the league moving forward. Because this season was supposed to test Caitlin Clark mentally. Stephanie White deserves serious credit for this transformation. One of the biggest differences compared to earlier stretches of the season is how much more organized the Fever offense looks late in games. Players are spacing the floor correctly. The transition opportunities are cleaner. The ball movement feels intentional instead of chaotic. And most importantly, Clark no longer looks isolated carrying the entire emotional burden herself. You can see teammates feeding off her confidence now. Kelsey Mitchell attacked with aggression. Boston controlled the interior. The bench energy stayed engaged all night. This looked like a connected basketball team. That matters because Indiana's ceiling has never depended solely on Clark scoring 40 points every night. Their real ceiling depends on whether Clark's gravity can consistently unlock everyone else around her. Friday night was the clearest evidence yet that it absolutely can. And now the conversation around the Fever changes completely. Earlier this season, people talked about Indiana like an entertaining young team still trying to figure itself out. After performances like this, that narrative becomes impossible to maintain. This team is no longer just interesting. They are becoming legitimately threatening. Not because they are flawless. Not because they suddenly solved every weakness. But because they now possess the single most dangerous quality in professional basketball. A superstar who can completely alter the emotional momentum of a game by herself. That changes everything. It changes how teams scout Indiana. It changes how national media discusses them. It changes how opponents mentally prepare before tip-off. Because now every team understands the risk. If Caitlin Clark gets emotionally activated and starts feeling rhythm from deep range, the entire game can disappear in 5 minutes. And that is exactly what happened to Golden State. The Valkyries fought hard for 2 quarters. Then Clark detonated the game open. And what makes the performance even more satisfying for Fever fans is the symbolism behind it. This was not just about beating an expansion franchise. This was about reclaiming the narrative after an exhausting week of speculation and criticism. Clark did not respond with a defensive statement on social media. She did not post cryptic messages. She did not complain publicly. She walked into a nationally discussed game furious and embarrassed the defense in front of her. That is the response of a superstar. And honestly, the timing could not be worse for the rest of the WNBA. Because confidence is visibly returning. The shooting rhythm looks sharper. The movement looks healthier. The emotional fire looks fully reignited. And if that combination continues building over the next few weeks, the Indiana Fever are going to become one of the most difficult teams in the entire league to survive offensively. Especially in transition. Because once Clark starts pushing pace after defensive rebounds, the geometry of the floor becomes impossible to contain. Defenders are forced to pick her up near half court, which immediately stretches defensive positioning. That opens cutting lanes. It opens trailing shooters. It opens dump-off passes to Boston around the rim. Everything expands. That is why her impact goes so much deeper than points per game. She changes spatial reality on the court. Very few athletes in basketball history possess that ability. And perhaps the most important detail from Friday night was this. Clark looked like she was having fun again. Not cautious. Not frustrated. Not burdened. Dangerous. Smiling after logo threes. Talking trash after big possessions. Celebrating with teammates. Emotionally alive. That version of Caitlin Clark is the version the league fears most because it usually means she is completely comfortable mentally. And when elite shooters become emotionally comfortable, the results become catastrophic for defenses. The Fever know it. The fans know it. And after Friday night, the Valkyries definitely know it too. Because for one explosive evening inside Gainbridge Fieldhouse, Caitlin Clark stopped looking like a superstar trying to survive the chaos surrounding her and started looking like the face of the league again. And if this is truly the beginning of her next gear, then the rest of the WNBA may have a massive problem coming.